In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the deep green of the pines meets the heavy gray of coal dust, Harlan County, Kentucky, felt like a world apart in the late 1980s. Life there was measured by the creaking of porch swings and the relentless song of crickets in the humid evening air. It was a place where history lived in the cracks of the sidewalks and the lines on the faces of miners returning home. Inside the Hale home, the atmosphere was warm, filled with the scent of fried chicken and the soft glow of a flickering television. The walls were lined with family photos, but one face stood out, radiating a light that seemed to defy the shadow of the mines. This was the world before the silence, a time when the American dream felt as tangible as the dirt under one's fingernails. That light belonged to Danny. At 17, he was the golden boy of the county, a high school football star whose name was whispered with reverence in local diners. In his jersey, number 32 stitched in bold white against blue fabric, he looked invincible. He was the promise of a future that didn't involve the dark tunnels of the mines. Danny had a smile that could bridge any gap and a kick that seemed to defy physics. While Marcus, his older brother, was content with the quiet rhythm of rural life, Danny was the one who was supposed to fly. He was the pride of his mother, Ruth, and the shadow that Marcus was happy to walk in, never knowing that the shadow would soon become a permanent darkness. The shift came in 1991, on a night that started with the mundane chill of a Lexington autumn. The transition from the familiar hills of Harlan to the stark concrete of the city was jarring. Outside a convenience store, the world was illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled of exhaust and damp pavement, a sharp contrast to the pine-scented breeze of home. In a moment of senseless violence, the trajectory of the Hale family was altered. Curtis Webb, a man whose name would become a curse in Marcus's mouth, stepped out of the shadows. There was no grand motive, just the flash of steel and the sound of life escaping into the night. It was a theft of a future, committed in the blink of an eye. When the sirens faded and the yellow tape was stretched across the lot, one image remained burned into memory. Danny's blue jersey, the one he had worn with pride, lay discarded on the cold asphalt. The white numbers were stained, the fabric torn, looking like a discarded flag after a lost war. For Marcus, this was the moment the dream shattered. He didn't feel sorrow. Instead, something far more dangerous took root in his chest. He didn't cry at the funeral or seek comfort in prayer. He simply hardened, his grief weaponizing into a cold blade of hatred. This hatred is a poison of the soul, a weight that many carry without realizing how much it drags us down. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We are building a community here at American Heartbeat, a place to share the stories that define us. This is American Heartbeat, and this story is not over. The rage Marcus felt for Curtis Webb was a deep fire that consumed everything. For years, the only thing that kept Marcus moving was the thought of the man in the orange jumpsuit. The narrator's voice begins to fade now, giving way to the gravelly tone of Marcus Hale himself. My life ended that night in Lexington. I spent 14 years building a prison in my mind, and I made sure Curtis Webb was the only other person in there with me. I didn't want peace. I wanted the kind of justice that leaves every soul feeling completely hollow. I called it the 14-year winter. From 1991 to 2005, the world outside saw the seasons cycle through spring blooms and summer heat. But inside my soul, the ground remained frozen solid. Grief didn't just sit there, it was a living thing that ate. It consumed my ambition, my relationships, and eventually the man I used to be. I lost jobs because I couldn't look a supervisor in the eye without seeing the face of the judge who didn't give Curtis Webb enough time. I turned to the bottle to quiet the screaming in my head, but the alcohol only fed the fire. I retreated into the hills of Harlan County, finding a rusted trailer that felt more like a tomb than a home. The floorboards creaked under the weight of my bitterness, and the only company I kept was the cold, biting wind that whistled through the window frames, whispering Danny's name in the dark. Twice during those years, I drove 4 hours to the North Point Training Center. I would pull my truck into the gravel parking lot, the engine idling like a trapped heart. I sat there for hours, the rain streaking the windshield like tears I refused to shed. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. I watched the high fences topped with silver razor wire and the heavy steel gates that separated the living from the caged. I wanted to walk in, I wanted to stand before the man who took my brother's light and tell him how much of a hollow shell I had become. I wanted to see him suffer, but I couldn't do it. Hatred was a heavy chain that kept me anchored to the driver's seat. Each time I eventually put the truck in reverse and drove back to my lonely life, feeling smaller than when I had arrived. The warmth of my childhood home had become a ghost. My trailer smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bourbon, a stinging contrast to the scent of cedar in Ruth's kitchen. My mother, Ruth, stayed in that old family house, her hair turning the color of frost and her shoulders stooping under the weight of a loss no mother should ever carry. She was a woman of the Kentucky hills, built of limestone and scripture. She didn't scream and she didn't throw things. She just endured. While I was jagged in my misery, she was steady in her faith. We barely spoke about Danny. The silence between us was a canyon. I was drowning in rage, and she was watching her only remaining son vanish into the shadows. In 2005, the winter reached its breaking point. Ruth was lying in a hospital bed, her fragile frame swallowed by sterile white sheets. The room smelled of sharp antiseptic and floor wax. The only sound in the dim light was the rhythmic, clinical beep of the heart monitor, a ticking clock marking the end of an era. I sat by her side, my hands rough and shaking. I felt a surge of anger even then, blaming the world and God for taking her too. I wanted to rail against the injustice, to find someone else to blame for her shallow, ragged gasps. She waited until the room was quiet. She reached out and took my hand with surprising strength. Her eyes, usually so soft, were piercing and clear. She didn't talk about the afterlife. She looked into the wreckage of my soul and whispered words that would shatter my world. She told me that hatred is a hole you're digging for two people, and she wouldn't have me buried next to that boy's killer. She told me I was already dead, just waiting for the dirt to hit the lid. Those words were a physical blow. She died that night, leaving me alone in a silence louder than any explosion. After the funeral, I returned to my trailer, but the walls felt closer. The shield I had built of rage finally began to crack. I saw the truth. I was the only one trapped inside this prison of my own making. The morning I finally drove to the North Point Training Center, the sky was a bruised and heavy purple, the kind of color that precedes a violent storm or a quiet sunrise. I didn't sit in the parking lot this time. I walked through the heavy gates, the metal clanging behind me like a bell tolling for my old self. Inside, the sterile atmosphere shifted to a suffocating institutional green. The walls were scrubbed clean but felt heavy with the weight of 1,000 regrets. The air was thick with the scent of industrial floor wax and the metallic tang of old radiator heat. I followed the guard's rhythmic footsteps down a long hallway, where the only music was the low, constant hum of flickering fluorescent lights. Every breath felt forced, as if the building itself were trying to squeeze the life out of my lungs. In the visitation room, I sat behind a pane of thick, scratched glass that had seen too many tears. When Curtis Webb walked in, he wasn't the monster I had fed in my nightmares for over a decade. He was just a man. He moved with a heavy, shuffling gait. His shoulders stooped under the weight of an orange jumpsuit that seemed too large for his thinning frame. As he sat down, the chair let out a sharp, metallic squeak that echoed against the cold linoleum. I looked into his eyes and didn't see a demon. I saw a broken man who had grown old in a cage, his skin the color of parched earth and his hair turned to a dull, dusty gray. The unsettling part wasn't his cruelty, but his humanity. He looked back at me with a gaze that wasn't defiant, but weary. He was a weary ghost, much like I had been for 14 years. The conversation wasn't a Hollywood climax. It was a slow, agonizing unburdening. We spoke through the muffled intercom, our voices flat and devoid of the theatricality I had expected. Nothing was magically fixed, but everything was finally acknowledged. I told him about young Danny, not the football star, but the brother who used to share his candy and talk about the stars. Curtis spoke too, his voice a low rasp, expressing a regret that didn't ask for pity but admitted to the waste of 2 lives on that Lexington street where everything changed. In that moment, I realized we were both survivors of the same tragic night. He had been the one to pull the trigger, but we had both been rotting in the aftermath. Forgiveness wasn't a fleeting feeling. It was a cold, calculated decision to put the heavy thing down. I looked through that cold glass and realized it was no longer a barrier between me and a killer, but a mirror reflecting a choice. I chose to let the hate go, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to breathe again. Today, at 52, I stand in the soft amber morning light of a simple Appalachian church. The wooden pews are worn smooth, and the scent of old hymnals fills the quiet air. I am no longer the man living in the rusted trailer or the prisoner of the parking lot. I still carry Danny's football jersey. The blue fabric is faded now, the white numbers softened by time. I hold it close during every talk I give, but it is no longer a shroud of grief. It is a reminder of the peace I chose. The true American spirit isn't just about winning, it's about the courage to heal and the audacity to offer redemption. Hatred is a prison with a door that only opens from the inside. I found my key in the very place I thought I'd find my end. If you are carrying a burden, remember you don't have to stay in the winter forever. In the comments below, leave the word "forgiven." God bless you. And God bless America.